Well, the Zags have 2 losses and are outside the top 10 of the AP poll for the first time in a very long time. So we answer the big question on today's show. Does this team still have a championship ceiling?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates through another season of Gonzaga Hoops. Today's episode is brought to you by Omaha Steaks. Omaha Steaks is a gift from the heart, a gift that will be remembered with every unforgettable bite. Order with complete confidence today, knowing you're ordering the very best. Visit omahasteaks.com. Use promo code LOCKEDON at checkout to get an extra $30 off your order. All right, as we have done to start the season, we are pushing Mailbag Monday to Mailbag Tuesday. Doesn't have as good of a ring, but I suppose the questions are still being submitted on Monday, so maybe we can still count it as Mailbag Monday. Got a ton of questions over the weekend and after the Xavier game on on Sunday, excuse me. So we're going to break up Mailbag a little bit. We're going to have a couple segments with some spillover Mailbag questions on Wednesday's episode as well. So if you submitted a question, you don't hear it answered in this show, check it out on Wednesday. I should have the answers to all your questions there. All right, we're going to get right into it because we have a lot to go over today. This first question comes from Jacob Quarter 2 on Twitter, who says, right now we can probably say that the 1 seed is out of the question in order to get the number 2 seed. In your opinion, do we need to win out or can we afford another loss or two? Yeah, I don't really understand the sentiment that 2-loss team can't be a 1 seed. Last year on December 4th, so today is November 29th, as you are listening to this, most likely. Last year on December 4th, the Zags had 2 losses. They still got a 1 seed. Like, it can still happen. Last year, the Zags had 2 losses to Duke and Alabama. They had wins over UCLA and Texas. They had a couple other close games against questionable teams. And then they got it going. They figured it out. They had a really nice win over A&M, blew through the conference tournament, ended up getting a 1 seed. Obviously, we know what happened after that. But I don't think that the Zags having 2 losses to literal top 5 teams in the AP poll, not just hypothetical top 5 teams, actual top 5 teams in the AP poll in Texas and Purdue. The Zags have 2 losses to them. They have a win over Michigan State. They have a win over Kentucky. They have a win over Xavier, who's not ranked yet, but is a solid program. I do not think that the Zags just are eliminated from being a 1 seed because of 2 losses early in the season, especially when they had 2 losses at around the same time last year and still got a 1 seed. Having said that, are the Zags right now one of the 4 best teams in college basketball? No, they are not. Are they capable of being one of the 4 best teams in college basketball? Yes. I don't know that they're going to be a 1 seed. I suspect that this is the year that streak is going to end, and they're probably going to be a 2 or a 3 seed somewhere in that range, mostly because there's just a lot of really good teams in college basketball this year, not a lot of great teams, which is what's going to make it a fairly fascinating NCAA tournament. But also, it's not even December yet, so there's a lot of time between now and March for many teams, not just Gonzaga, to kind of figure it out. But crowning a team as incapable of being a 1 seed because they have 2 losses in November is silly to me and not entirely accurate or representative of what typically happens, as we know literally by looking at this team last year. Next question comes from @UserDadRisk on Twitter, who says, over under 5.5 losses on Selection Sunday for the Zags, over under 3.5 seed. Yeah, I think under for both. I think they're probably going to lose 1 between Baylor and Alabama because those are 2 really, really tough games. Alabama looks like a top 10 team. Baylor remains a top 10 team as well. 2 really, really solid programs. But let's say we split those games. They have 3 losses. I don't see 3 more losses on the schedule. St. Mary's is obviously tough. You got to watch out for Washington. They can clip you. Heck, Portland looks really good right now. BYU on the road, even though BYU is down, is always a tough game. Like, there's some challenging games on the schedule, and Gonzaga has certainly showed more weaknesses than they have in previous years. But I don't see this team being a 6+ loss team. I just don't see it. They've gotten through a big chunk of the hardest part of their schedule. They won a lot of really good games. They've beaten 3 very good teams so far this year, lost to 2 of them. I think they got a couple more good games. They're going to probably endure at least a couple more losses, maybe one more loss, but I'd be surprised if they're finished below 6. And if they are less than a 6-loss team, there's no way they're lower than the 3 seed. I think they're a 2 seed, 3 seed, somewhere in that conversation. Certainly if things unravel a little bit more, then we could see them drop, but I would be pretty surprised if that happens. Next question comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, all of Gonzaga's losses have a similar theme where the other team is able to get hot from long range. The Zags have questionable shots early in the shot clock. With that said, in each loss, the other team has scored fewer and fewer points and had smaller shooting percentages in those games. Despite the losses, are we seeing progress as Gonzaga, the team, comes together through this extremely difficult non-conference season? Well, yeah, of course, I would sure hope we're seeing progress. Otherwise, there's no point in scheduling these games. Mark Few has been telling us for weeks, for months, like, hey, this team is not going to be ready right away. They need time to gel. You're asking a bunch of players to play different roles. I mean, who I can think of only a few players who are basically doing the same thing they did last year. Drew Timme, Anton Watson, Julian Strother at times, but also he's asked to play a pretty significantly different role. Rasir Bolden at times, but he's also been asked to kind of play out of position. And then you have Nolan Hickman, who's asked to play an entirely different role. Hunter Salas, who's asked to pick up a big chunk of the role. You have Malachi Smith and Efton Reed, who are brand new to the team, brand new to the offense, brand new to the system. Ben Gregg is picking up a different role. So you have like 1 or 2 guys, maybe 3 guys who are doing the same thing as they were doing last year. You put them in the schedule where they have 5 ridiculously tough games early in the season. They come out of it with more wins than losses. Yeah, that's pretty darn good. I'd be pretty happy about that. I know that the losses look very bad, and I'm not just glossing over them as just calling them losses. They were blowouts, and there is something to that. I don't want to seem like flippant or cavalier about that. Getting blown out like that is not good, and it was frustrating and difficult to watch. But at the end of the day, this team has won more games than they have lost. They have played very good teams. They have beaten good teams. They have lost to extraordinarily good teams, and we have seen them continue to get better and more comfortable in their offense as the season goes on. And like, it's not December yet. It's not even December. Next question comes from Mark at Can I Ball on Twitter, who says, going into the season, most of us consider depth to be one of our greatest assets. Again, we are seeing a shortened rotation on the starters playing heavy minutes in big games. Are there legitimate concerns with how the staff develops a bench? Yeah, I've kind of talked about this in the past, and it is a criticism I have levied against Mark Few and the staff in previous years of being too inconsistent about playing depth players, be too reliant on the starters. We've talked about how we've seen some guys appear to look fatigued going into the NCAA tournament or through the NCAA tournament, go on cold streaks. Corey Kispert a couple years ago, Julian Strother last year, 2 examples of that. Even Andrew Nembhard in that game against Arkansas looked gassed, and he played basically every minute of the last couple of games. So Few has done this in the past, but he has made it very clear, and he said this after the Xavier game when he was referencing Ben Gregg, but he said, and I thought this was an important quote, is playing on this team and playing in these games is a privilege. It is not a right. You do not get to play on this team simply because you are one of the players on this roster. You do not get to play because we should play 9 guys, so we're just going to play 9 guys. That is not how Mark Few operates. You play if you have earned the playing time. If he does not believe that you have earned the right to play in those games, even if he's only got 6 or 7 guys who he thinks have earned that right, that's all he's going to play. He has been very adamant about that, very staunch about that. This year, we're seeing a lot of guys who aren't getting the playing time that people thought that they might get, names that we're going to talk about later in the show or perhaps tomorrow, depending on where those mailbag questions were. But I'm going to continue to come back to this quote. Mark Few has said it. Playing on this team is a privilege, not a right. If you haven't earned the opportunity to play for this team, he's not going to play you. He has been consistent about that for 20 years. Looking back at his track record, I'm certainly not going to question it. Having said that, I do hope that there's opportunities for some of the starters to get a little bit of rest as we get into conference play so that they're not as gassed getting into the March tournament. Final question of the segment comes from John via Gmail. John says, at what point after losing to Texas by 19 and giving up 93 points and losing to Purdue, do we start to believe that instead of not playing well or having a bad game, that maybe Gonzaga isn't as good as we thought they would be when the experts ranked them number 2 to start the season? This was, so I understand why people are asking these questions. I'm not going to entertain the other questions I received about if this team is even going to make the NCAA tournament, which is a ludicrous thing to assume about a team that has lost 2 games to literal top 5 opponents. I'm going to continue to hammer that home. Texas and Purdue are 2 of the 5 best teams in the country. Does this mean Gonzaga maybe isn't number 2? Yeah. Does getting ranked number 2 when in actuality you're maybe like a top 10 or 15 team, does that scream some huge problem? No. This is a dang good basketball team who, again, we need to listen to Mark Few when he tells us, hey, this team is not going to be ready at the start of the year. Drew Timme said it. Anton Watson said it. Mark Few said it. Brian Michelson said it. Everybody said it. Hey, it's going to take this team some time to gel and get the pieces together. They don't have a diaper dandy in the Chet Holmgren or a Jalen Suggs. They don't have an experienced veteran point guard like Andrew Nembhard. We knew this team was going to take some time, and Mark Few put together the hardest non-conference schedule in history. The results, yes, the blowouts are bad, but the results in the sense of them having 3 wins, 2 losses, again, not even that different from where they were last year when they did have Chet Holmgren, when they did have Andrew Nembhard. They still lost 2 games by early December, around the same time as now. Treating this team like they're not good anymore, like they might not be an NCAA tournament, is just a very, very extreme overreaction to a couple of bad losses for a team that doesn't suffer bad losses very often. And the fan base, the way that they've responded to them, it's pretty apparent that this isn't something we're very used to. All right, more listener submitted questions coming your way, including Ben Gregg's excellent weekend and the status for Brayden Huff. But first, today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Omaha Steaks. The holidays are here. Achieve gifting greatness when you give the gift of perfectly aged, tender, and delicious Omaha Steaks. Omaha Steaks is America's original butcher since 1917 and a holiday gift that's guaranteed to be loved. The steak experts at Omaha Steaks have put together special curated gift packages to help take the guesswork out of gifting and make you a holiday hero. Go to omahasteaks.com and use code LOCKEDON at checkout to get $30 off your order. Set an assortment of mouth-watering favorites guaranteed to impress, like the legendary Butcher's Cut filet mignon, air-chilled boneless chicken, ultra-juicy burgers, and even easy-to-prepare comfort meals that are ready in a flash. Omaha Steaks is ready to ship your order right away, so shop early and beat the shipping rush. Omaha Steaks is a gift from the heart. A gift that will be remembered with every unforgettable bite. Order with complete confidence today, knowing you're ordering the very best. Visit omahasteaks.com. Use promo code LOCKEDON at checkout to get that extra $30 off your order. A minimum order may be required. All right, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags. Want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen of the day as we power through these mailbag questions ahead of Gonzaga's big game against Baylor. This next question comes from @StrikeNowhere on Twitter, who says, does Ben Gregg fit the Tilly mold in terms of how he will be used? I see a lot of possible parallels there, minus the volleyball background. Yeah, I think Ben's been compared to Killian Tilly since the day he committed to Gonzaga back in 2020, September of 2020, shortly after the Zags missed out on Paolo Banchero. They made an offer to Ben Gregg. He accepted pretty much immediately. And from there on, the Killian Tilly comparison started. I've talked about it on the podcast. Many other people have talked about it on their podcasts or on the radio shows. It's an easy comparison to make. He's similar size, good outside shooter. You're kind of hoping for some more defensive intensity and some more physicality from Ben Gregg. We saw that this weekend for the first time in his Gonzaga career. He went up against Zach Edey. He held his own. He grabbed 3 offensive rebounds against Xavier. Like, that's the kind of stuff that Killian Tilly did that I think. And I'm not saying that this is how this question is doing it, but people have often referred to Killian Tilly as just a stretch 4. I was like, oh, he's a big guy who could shoot. Tilly could do a lot more than that. He was a good rebounder, a good defensive player, all of that stuff. And we're starting to see some of that stuff kind of show up for Ben Gregg as well. Consistency from the outside is obviously the key thing. Killian Tilly was a 40% three-point shooter for 4 years at Gonzaga. The amount of consistency that he had is jarring and really, really hard to replicate. Ben hasn't been there yet, but that doesn't mean that he won't get there. But he's farther behind where Tilly was development-wise at this time in his career, but that doesn't mean that he's not going to get to be a similar type player as Killian when he kind of reaches his full potential. Next question comes from Dad Risk on Twitter, who says, comments on the apparent death of the small ball lineup, merely a byproduct of Malachi underwhelming or something with Timmy's shortcomings as well. Timmy played fine with 4 guards in 2020. Granted, they were all NBA players. The Zags have been running the small ball lineup. I'm not sure they haven't run it as often, but they have been running it with Julian Strother playing the 4. I think a big reason they've played less of it has just been matchup dependent. It's just matchups. The Zags in previous years, when the Zags ran this lineup more, they weren't, they didn't have these they didn't play Zach Edey. a couple of years ago when they ran this lineup. They didn't play a Texas team that is full of long athletic dudes a couple of years ago. They didn't play a Michigan State team that has a ton of size, a ton of strength down on the block. Yes, I think it's just matchups. I really do. And I think the other thing is the emergence of Anton Watson. 2 years ago when they ran a lot of small ball 4 lineups, Anton Watson was not one of Gonzaga's 5 best players. He was maybe not one of Gonzaga's 7 best players on that team. Now he is. He is very clearly one of their 5 best players, and he might be one of their 3 best players. And so getting him more playing time, and especially when he's the Gonzaga's best player at getting the ball to Drew Timme. In the Texas game, he was the only player who could make the entry pass to Drew. You have to play the only guy who has the playmaking skills, who has the physicality, who has the ability to actually get the ball to Drew Timme. When other guards were struggling with that physicality, were struggling to do that, and they had to turn to Anton, you could see why that might be the death of the small ball lineup. I don't think it has anything to do with Drew. I think it has to do more with Gonzaga's guards not stepping up. The Malachi Smith point is fair, but I think it has more to do with Anton Watson just being a player that Gonzaga needs to have on the floor many minutes every single game. Next question comes from Jamie via Gmail. Jamie says, do you think an over-reliance on Drew Timme has stunted the growth of our offense as a whole? In both lopsided losses this year, Timme has still produced, but the guys around him often looked timid and passive. I'm mainly thinking of Hickman, Smith, and Salas, all who seem more reluctant to assert themselves than I would have expected at this point in their careers. At this point in their careers, Malachi Smith is like 6 games into his career at Gonzaga. He's adjusting to a brand new role, brand new league, brand new team. I think expecting a lot from him early in the year when they've played this kind of schedule is a little bit, it's too much expectation on him early. Hickman and Salas are adjusting to brand new roles as well. This is kind of a chicken and the egg thing. I think it's a fair question. I don't think that an over-reliance on Drew Timme has stunted the growth. I think those pieces aren't where the Zags need them to be, so they're relying too much on Drew Timme. The Michigan State game is a great example of that. The Zags attempted to run their normal offensive sets. They did what they planned to do, what they practiced all offseason, what they've been drilling into these guys. Here's how to run our ball screen offense. Here's how to get the ball to Drew. Here's how to do this. And it didn't work. And there was other factors there, the extenuating circumstances of the game, of the facility, the being outside, all of that stuff. But in the second half, they just stopped running their offense, just got the ball to Drew. And they pretty much did. They did that in ways against Texas as well, or attempted to. And so I don't think it's that they're only giving the ball to Drew so the other guys aren't developing. I think the other guys aren't where they need them to be, so they're just going to give the ball to Drew so they can get victories and try to win games, and they'll work on that other stuff when they get more time as the season goes on. We've already seen many improvements in many of those areas. Nolan Hickman had an incredible weekend against Purdue against Purdue and Xavier. I think he averaged 14.5 points, 5 assists, shot over 40% from 3. He looked awesome this weekend. His development is not a concern to me going forward. Next question comes from Austin via Gmail. Austin says, Friday against Purdue, Gonzaga seemed to have a better handle on the ball. They had less turnovers, which was great to see. What was the issue, though? ED just too big to handle, bad shots turned to bad defense, rebounding, or just a little bit of everything? Yeah, they missed a lot of open shots against Purdue, which is uncharacteristic, but problematic, as kind of similar to what downed them against Arkansas. When you get a lot of good looks and you just don't make them, that can be really frustrating. And then Purdue just played great. I think a lot of this game said a lot more to me about Purdue than it said about Gonzaga. And I know that that's challenging for many people to kind of accept, because you want takeaways about your team, not necessarily about other teams. But Purdue's just really, really good. Criminally underrated at 24 when that game happened. They're top, and now they're 5th. So that tells you a little bit more. If that matchup had been number 5 Purdue versus number 11 or 12 Gonzaga, you'd still don't want to get blown out the way that they did. And there were some challenges that come with getting blown out that way. But Purdue's really, really good. Zach Edey's an absolute load. He's really skilled with the basketball. Purdue's guards much better than people gave them credit for, and they just played a really, really good game. Next question, final one of the segment, comes from @MusicInABlender on Twitter, who says, I might have missed this in one of your earlier pods, but is Brayden Huff injured, or is he redshirting? I assume he's redshirting. Just to be clear on the redshirt rules, you don't apply for a redshirt before the season happens. So he is not designated as redshirting. There's not a tag that he is redshirting. No coaches or anybody is going to say that he is redshirting, because you wait till the season's over. Your compliance officer files paperwork. Paperwork goes to the NCAA. NCAA in this case would approve it if he didn't play, and then he has then redshirted. So that's kind of how it works. So right now he could play. They could play him. I have not heard any update that he is hurt. I do not believe that he is hurt. This coaching staffs and colleges are pretty reluctant to provide information because they don't have to. So if he is hurt, we may not know. But my assumption is, I just don't think he's good enough to play right now. He's not better than Ben Gregg. He's not better than Efton Reed. Caden Perry is hurt, presumably, but even if he wasn't, I'm not sure I don't think that Brayden would play over Caden if Caden was healthy. So I don't think Brayden Huff's going to play this year. I think he's going to eventually end up getting that redshirt tag, but I don't think it is because of an injury. All right, folks, we're going to talk about the upcoming game against the Baylor Bears and some of the stuff that Mark Few is clearly preaching with this team to get them ready for that big game coming up right after this. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked on Zags, still rolling here through Mailbag Tuesday or a delayed Mailbag Monday if you prefer it to sound a little bit smoother. This next question comes from @SentientTK on Twitter, who says, 3 things that you think Mark Few is hammering into this team this week before the Baylor game that the Zags need to improve upon. Handling pressure from opposing guards and still being able to make the entry pass to Drew. That's the number one thing. This is what they struggled with mightily in the Texas game. They did better in the Purdue game and the Xavier game and really the rest of their games at getting the ball to Drew Timme. But Baylor is relentless about this. They were the first team to really expose this significant flaw for the Gonzaga Bulldogs in that 2021 national championship game. And it's the recipe to beat Gonzaga is, I don't want to say simple, but if you can figure out a way to prevent Drew Timme from getting the basketball, that's going to help you a lot. And so for the Zags, finding a way to handle that pressure from Baylor's guards and still make those entry passes is huge. Next up, defensive rotations. Making sure shooters are accounted for. Adam Flagler, really, really good outside shooter. LJ Cryer's fantastic guard. Keontae George hasn't really been the guy that Baylor expect him to be yet, but he's due to have some really, really big performances coming up soon as well. So for the Zags, making sure that they are not getting caught in rotation hell where they're all behind a spot and somebody gets a wide open 3 because Baylor's going to kill you if you do that. And then finally, transition offense. The Zags haven't really gotten out in transition all that much this year. In some games, they haven't really prioritized it because they're just focusing on grabbing the defensive rebounds. I think that that's an okay strategy, especially against teams like Purdue and in some of the other matchups they've had. But it'd be nice to see them attempt to get out in transition and put a little bit more pressure on Baylor to get back and put a little bit more pressure on them just to it's an easy way to get points. And for Gonzaga, this game is if every time they get the ball, they're coming up in their half court offense and Baylor's able to put pressure on their guards, that's going to make things more difficult. The best thing Gonzaga can do is try to get free points and easy buckets. And an easy way to do that is get out in transition as much as possible. Next question comes from @Havila Benjamin on Twitter, who says, prediction of Caleb Lohner's stat line against the Zags. He's currently averaging 7 and 5 for Baylor while shooting 62.5%. Will we see some fireworks between him and some Zags who have played against him for a while, like Timmy and Watson? I doubt it. I don't. Neither. I mean, Anton Watson's an intense dude, and Drew Timme, like, they're competitive guys. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think that Caleb Lohner really registers on their radar as somebody that they need to like fight with or have some kind of beef with. I doubt it. I don't think there's going to be any fireworks there. They'll say hi to each other. Maybe they'll jostle each other a little bit in positions for rebounds, maybe a little more than usual, but I'd be pretty surprised if we see anything noteworthy between those guys in this game. As for Lohner, I think he's going to have a bit of a quiet night. I think Baylor's going to focus really heavily on attacking Gonzaga with their guards. And I think that Gonzaga is a bit more prepared for what Lohner is and you know how to watch for him on the court. I'll give a prediction for his line of 4 points, 4 boards. Let's go with that. Next question comes from @JacobQuarter2 on Twitter, who says, looking ahead at the rest of the schedule, what teams are you worried about Zags matching up against? I don't really get worried about any of their games. Obviously, it sucks when they lose, but I think that a lot of the games that are potential losses for the Zags are good losses. So I know this is the second time I've been kind of pedantic on one of your questions, Jacob, so I apologize for that. But Baylor and Alabama are obviously the 2 tough games coming up. Baylor on Friday, the Zags, have had some time to kind of recoup from what happened in Portland and figure out like what are the pros, what are the cons, what are the things we need to work on, but they don't get a lot of time. Baylor's on Friday. It's coming up pretty soon. They don't have a lot of time to prepare for that game. Alabama is now a top 10 team, looked fantastic against North Carolina, has played a really, really good season so far, obviously beat the Zags last year. This game's going to be more of a home adjacent game for them. So those are 2 tough games. Again, those would be decent losses depending on how they happened. So I don't think that they're like cataclysmic losses or like season ending losses or anything like that. And I think that there's a chance that they win to both of them. Obviously, I'm inclined to believe they're going to split, but nothing else really jumps out at me. You got to be careful with Kent State. They, only lost to 5 to Houston, who's the number 1 team in the country. Washington always plays Gonzaga tough, so you got to watch out for that. Conference play, of course, this is the usual suspects. You can kind of toss Portland into the mix as well, but nobody I'm really worried about. Baylor and Alabama give me tough wins. I'd be surprised if they win both of them, but I'm not worried if they lose those games. Next question comes from Darren via Twitter DM. Darren says, watching Arizona versus Creighton, I have to wonder, does Oumar Ballo develop like this if he stayed at GU? I don't see why not. I've seen this question a handful of times, and Gonzaga recruited him. Gonzaga's reputation for developing big men, they're nearly batting 1,000. I cannot think of one big man outside of Oumar Ballo, one big man who has gotten better after leaving Gonzaga. It was Ryan Spangler. It was over a decade ago. He went to Oklahoma. He's from there. He was just homesick in Spokane, went home, played really well there. That is it. Gonzaga develops bigs at an elite rate. Their success on big men is extraordinary. They targeted, and I say they, Tommy did. Tommy found Oumar Ballo. Tommy recruited him. Tommy brought him to Spokane. He didn't have a great first year. He had an injury. He was behind a bunch of guys. He just didn't fit in. Tommy left. Of course, Oumar is going to follow Tommy. A very logical thing to happen. He's the guy who recruited him. He's the guy who convinced him to come out to play college basketball. And then Oumar turned out great. And I'm not saying that Oumar just happened to be good and it wasn't anything to do with Tommy. Tommy and the staff there really did a good job to develop him into the player that he is. And I'm sure learning from Christian Koloko last year really helped. But I don't buy this sentiment that Ballo wouldn't have been good if he'd stayed at Gonzaga, because their track record for developing bigs is nearly spotless. And I don't see a reality where Ballo would have stayed and just not gotten better in a Spokane uniform. Final question of the show comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, last year, Kansas suffered several blowout losses, most notably a 24-point blowout loss at home against Kentucky. Before they put it all together, had a great March and won the national title. What are the chances Gonzaga could do the same kind of thing this season come March 2023? Yeah, loved being able to end the show with this one, because so many people's concerns right now are about how low of a seed is Gonzaga going to be, or are they going to make the tournament, which we've seen a handful of times, which is again startling belief system by some people. But yeah, also sometimes teams have bad losses in November and then win the dang national championship. This has happened before. I mentioned already, Gonzaga was a 2-loss team at almost the exact same time last year and still got a number 1 seed. Heck, North Carolina was an 8 seed last year. They were crap for most of the regular season. Crap. They were not a good team. They put it together in March, went on a nice run. Boom. They were in the national championship game, had a legitimate shot at winning it all. UCLA a few years ago, Jalen Suggs hit a 39-footer that stopped them from going to the national championship game as a play-in 11 seed. You just have to get hot at the right time. That's it. That's what makes college basketball so dang beautiful, is we can analyze every little thing that happens from November 7th until February 28th. We can analyze all of them, and it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It just matters what happened in March. That is what matters. This team has the absolute talent to win 6 games in March. Absolutely they do. Unquestionably they do. Right now, the way that they're playing, would I expect that they would go on a 6-game win streak in March in the NCAA tournament? No, I would not. They are not consistent enough. They're having issues on the defensive end of the floor. The communication issues are there. The outside shooting is inconsistent. A second star behind Drew Timme. Julian Strother is kind of that guy, but he hasn't stepped into that role entirely. They have flaws. I don't want to end the show making it seem like, well, they're going to be fine. They're going to win a championship. I don't know about that, but I don't think that how they're playing in November necessarily means anything, frankly, about how they're going to play in March. Look at North Carolina. Look at UCLA from a couple of years ago. Look, there's so many. You use Kansas as the question here. Kansas is a great example. They got their bell rung by Kentucky. They got smacked by Kentucky. It was well, it's Kentucky. Gonzaga's losses are better. Gonzaga's losses are better than a 24-point loss to Kentucky last year. Gonzaga's losses, 19-point loss to Texas, 19-point loss to Purdue on a true road game and a neutral site game for Purdue. 2 top 5 teams, not terrible losses, not terrible losses. For Gonzaga, they obviously have stuff to work on. We have talked about that ad nauseum. We're going to continue to talk about it. Some of those flaws are going to show up against Baylor. I promise you. I promise you those flaws are going to be there against Baylor. And we're going to have a lot of these same conversations the Monday after the Baylor game. And hopefully Alabama goes well. Hopefully, Washington isn't a team that picks them off and we go into the conference play with three losses. I think would be totally reasonable to go into conference play, but it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that they're not going to win the championship. Doesn't mean that they're, destined to fail more epically than any Gonzaga team has ever failed before. But it doesn't mean that they're like, oh yeah, they're going to be fine. They're going to roll in March and be good. I don't know necessarily, but teams have done this before. Getting hot in March is what matters. If playing a really rigorous non-conference schedule and getting smacked around by a couple of teams when you're really not used to getting smacked around at all, if that's what it takes for this team to gel at the right time, I hope they lose to Baylor by 30. If that's what it takes, if that is what it takes for this team to be ready to roll in March, so be it. I think that that's really the way that we need to be thinking about this and concentrating on this as a fan base. And I know that it's hard, especially when they've lost games in ways that they haven't lost games in a really long time. But it just matters how ready you are in March. And plenty of teams have suffered losses similar to this and have not only turned it around and had successful seasons, they've won the freaking national championship, just like Kansas last year. Perhaps Gonzaga will do the same thing. All right, that is going to do it for me today. Don't forget to check out the new podcast, Locked On College Basketball, where myself and Isaac Shade of Locked On Tar Heels break down the biggest stories in all of college sports. That is, of course, available on YouTube and wherever you get podcasts. Finally, I want to thank you all for making Locked On Zags your first listen of the day. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. All right, thank you all for listening, and go Zags.